Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today, and for the many folks that I understand are listening on Zoom too, and I hope are hearing me properly. It is a shame that we'll have to cut a little earlier than planned, but I do want to stress that I will stick around afterwards for lunch. I'm happy to answer any questions there, and if it feels like we're still getting a good Q&A and we can reconstitute it out there, I would be happy to do that as well. So also before I begin my talk, I want to make sure to thank both Fordham and the New York Public Library, not just for giving me this platform, but even more importantly to me, for bringing me out here to do this research. I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to get the opportunity. And I will add that I'm specifically lucky and privileged that I get to do this research in New York City and at such a wonderful institution like the New York Public Library. Not to belabor the point, but if you do American Jewish history and live in the United States, you tend to go to one of two different archives. You either go to the archive in Cincinnati or the archive in New York City. And not to say anything negative about Cincinnati, but I feel very lucky that my research brings me here and not anywhere else. So thank you so much for having me here today. As I was introduced, I'm going to be talking today about New York Capitol and the making of the State of Israel. I'd like to start my talk today with a political cartoon that appeared in the Arab Palestinian newspaper Palestine in 1932. In the center of this cartoon are what, to most of us, is probably a relatively familiar set of images. Right in the middle, you see Lord Balfour, the British Lord, holding his famous Balfour Declaration, as it was called, which is the British proclamation of support for the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. To his right, our left, we see Jewish settlers moving into the region. And to his left, our right, we see, this is a political cartoon, so it is a critique of this, Arabs supposedly being pushed out or losing access to their land in some way, connected through this set of arrows. Around him, however, is what is perhaps a more surprising set of illustrations, the industrial and capitalist development of the region. So if we look in the upper left-hand corner, we see the Palestine Electrical Corporation that was creating the electric grid that was transforming the entire region. Down in the lower left, we see the port at Haifa Bay, which connected the Eastern Mediterranean to the rest of the world, particularly the British Empire, and the factories that were invested around it. On the coastal plains below, we see the tractor representing mechanized agriculture. And in the upper right corner, we see mining, mineral extraction at the Dead Sea from the corporation Palestine Potash Limited, which is extracting the extremely valuable mineral of potash from the Dead Sea. For a long time, historians were mostly interested in the pictures at the center here: British proclamation, the Zionist movement, Arab displacement or rejection of Zionism. This really centered what early research on Mandate Palestine was. For the last 20 years, we've seen a real broadening to include this fuller picture, which at least the artist of this cartoon clearly saw as connected. How capitalism and industrial development were connected to the transformation of political power and who was even inhabiting the land in the region. There have been great strides in that scholarship. And so when I was exposed to this cartoon, I already had some sort of background on it, but it did prompt a different question for me. Where did the money come from? Where did the money come from for these sort of massive economic capitalist projects? Now, most people in this room probably know that the Zionist movement was a global movement. It connected donations from Jews around the world and spent that money in Palestine. But the Zionist movement was constantly plagued by budget shortfalls. And there was a huge difference between buying land for agriculture, which was the focus of Zionist funds, and, say, creating an electrical grid, which most economists estimate is the most expensive capital expenditure converted to real dollars made in history. And so as I started to dig into this question a little bit more, I found a rather curious answer. All of the projects pictured here, though in various degrees, received capital investment from the same organization, the Palestine Economic Corporation. And even more curious, this corporation was founded almost entirely by New York Jews, a wealthy New York elite, and yet they insisted time and again that their actions in Palestine were non-political and non-Zionist. And so this is the mystery that we're going to be working on unraveling today, to understand how did these transformations happen And why was it so important to maintain this claim of being non-political to these individuals? So before we dig into that, I want to just touch on the idea of capitalism in the Yishuv, just to define that term too. Yishuv is the term we use for the Jewish settlement before the state of Israel, so the Ottoman Empire and then British-ruled Palestine. The reason historians use that term is because everyone in the region at this time, to some degree or another, called themselves Palestinian or applied the term Palestine to the region. Arabs more than Jews, but both did use that term. So we need a different term to differentiate. We use the term Yishuv, literally means settlement, to refer to the Jewish population at that time. Capitalism in the Yishuv is not something that we talk about that much, at least in kind of the cultural memory of what the pre-state and early state of Israel looked like. The reason for that, I think, is these two images we see here. On your left, we see the image, kind of depiction, an artist depiction of the kibbutz. The utopian socialist influenced settlements that were mostly agriculture in nature and had radical experiments in shared property, even shared child rearing. Really, it embraces kind of socialist ethos. On the right, we have the pushke, the donation box of the Jewish National Fund, which Jews around the world put little coins in of philanthropic, dollars to be donated to then buy land in Mandate Palestine. These are the two images that really stick in the cultural memory and don't leave much room for the idea of capitalism. But the reality is, at its peak, only 5% of the Jewish population ever lived on a kibbutz, and even that number is probably a little high. And as I mentioned previously, the donation funds, the Jewish National Fund, were constantly in shortfall. The reality is that Palestine, like much of the rest of the world at this time, was transforming into a capitalist economy, one that was connected to global markets, especially through the export of oranges. The Jaffa orange was considered the greatest orange in the world at the time. It was a huge economic driver for the region. Also, the port at Haifa Bay that I mentioned previously, where oil from Mosul was being piped in to send out to the rest of the world. Again, that was British oil, this British, influence in Iraq. And then finally, potash extraction at the Dead Sea. All of these were huge economic drivers of the region and attracted the attention of global investors, but also were seen as coming with a lot of risk. Palestine was perceived as underdeveloped, not understood by Western financiers. And so there was both this push-pull factor in this creation of the capitalist economy in the region. All right, so what are we here to learn today? As was mentioned, I also do some journalist writing, and I am told time and again that us academics do a really bad job of what journalists call burying the lead. We do not tell you our point. And so I am going to break that cycle, and I'm going to be very explicit in what I want you to leave here with. First, is that a group of New York Jewish investors were critical to the formation of a capitalist economy in Mandate Palestine, and ultimately, therefore, to the state-building process. Second, these investors were trying to navigate a narrow path between competing pressures. On the one hand, you have anti-Semitism, both in the US and abroad. On the other hand, you have acculturation, or what some folks would call assimilation, the desire to have a truly 100% American identity while maintaining a Jewish identity, something that was seen as a real challenge at the time, and maybe still, as we'll have in some other discussions coming up here at Fordham, still seen by many as a challenge today. And then Jewish internationalism, that's the term I use for their feelings of connection to other Jews abroad. Even as this group, as I'll talk about, was very insistent upon their own American identity, they never denied a feeling of connection and a desire to help other Jews across the world. And then finally, although largely unintended, their investment led to stark divergences in the economic and political fortunes of Jews and Arabs in the Mandate. So our tour guide today is going to be the non-Zionist leader, Felix Warburg. And by tour guide, I mean he will be kind of the central focus. And most importantly, I chose him because he gives the best quotes, as you'll see in a minute. He is the one in the bottom picture over here with the fantastic mustache and great hat. He was one of the most important Jewish philanthropic leaders of the era. He founded the Federation, the Jewish Federation of New York. He founded the Joint Distribution Committee, both major philanthropies that still exist today. He was also a successful banker, a partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, the second largest investment bank of the era, rivaled only by JP Morgan. But he was very open with the fact that he didn't really enjoy banking and he wanted to work as little as possible. And so he mostly spent his time and his fortune when he could on his Jewish communal work. The other folks in this in this picture are also critical folks to the story. They'll be talking about them a little less. In the upper right corner, we have Lewis Marshall. Marshall was a civil rights attorney and seen in his era as the most important Jewish leader. There was a joke at the time playing off of his name that American Jews lived under martial law. Get it? The double entendre in the name. It wasn't an amazing joke, but it was a joke. He headed the American Jewish Committee and probably would have had to have been the focus of our story today if he didn't die in 1929. So he only lives through half of the period we're talking about. But that's okay because he doesn't have as awesome of quotes as Warburg. And then the third picture is Herbert Lehman, another leader of the Palestine Economic Corporation, who also became governor of New York, and was a senator here. Whew, I almost got that wrong in front of a room of New Yorkers. Our talk will be divided into 3 brief sections. Section 1 is skepticism. Section 2 is investment. And section 3 is consequences. However, since these are very boring names for each section, I've also paired each with a much more exciting quote from Felix Warburg. Section 1 is also titled, "If Palestine is to become anything but the trash basket of dissatisfied Jews or Jewish politicians, it has to become more than an arrogant, conceited, perhaps Hebrew-talking mob devoid of the humility of the Jewish religion." I told you, he gives great quotes. Part 2, the second subtitle is, "We can do for Palestine what we have done for other countries, help it stand on its own legs as soon as possible, and stop charity as soon as possible, and let the laws of economics take their course." We're seeing a real transformation here. That was said in 1928. And then a quote in his obituary in 1937, "My devotion to the Jewish cause and to Palestine is unabated, and I shall continue to lend my best efforts to support our work, which challenges our deepest interest to develop Palestine. Zionists and non-Zionists come together in this period of hope and enthusiasm." So this is the transformation we'll be tracing in our 3 parts as well. So part 1, skepticism. I'm not going to read this great quote to you again, but it's up on the board. So who was Felix Warburg and why did he feel this way? And just to do a little thought experiment, can anyone here imagine the current head of the Federation of New York City saying anything like this about the state of Israel, the population there? But this was a very different time. And in fact, this quote, although maybe a little more bombastic, was somewhat representative of the 1920s view of the New York Jewish elite towards Palestine. This was a group that had really seen incredible success in the United States. Many were involved with banking, were phenomenally wealthy, like Warburg himself. And they rested on a thesis that if we can be this successful in the United States, this is where Jews can find that success in general. And the sort of trade we make for this is that we pledge 100% loyalty. We say we are nothing but 100% American of the Jewish religion. They'll say things like we are Hebrews of the Mosaic persuasion to really get at this idea that they really want to show an embrace of their American identity. So you can imagine if this is your central thesis of Jewish success in the United States, a group of Jews, much less also they tended to be poor, more Yiddish speaking, maybe a little embarrassing in their mannerisms, starts moving to the Lower East Side and saying, actually, maybe Judaism is a national identity, and maybe we should speak Hebrew, and maybe we should consider moving to Palestine. This was seen as an enormous threat to the kind of acculturated elite of the Upper East Side. And so you get this real feeling of disdain and actually some fear towards the movement of Zionism. It also didn't help that a Zionist demand at the time was the democratization of Jewish communities. So they were calling for folks like Felix Warburg, they were calling him an oligarch and said that he shouldn't get to decide how the Jewish community is run. So that really didn't help relations, as you can imagine. This picture here, by the way, is Warburg with his wife, Frieda Schiff Warburg, and his father-in-law, Jacob Schiff. Warburg, as I mentioned, came from an important banking family and then had the good fortune to marry, really it does seem for love, a woman from an even richer banking family. Jacob Schiff was the most important partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company and gave Felix his partnership despite his non-desire to work there very much, and on a requirement that they move to the United States. And so that's what brought Felix here. He is a little exceptional from the other non-Zionist leaders in that he was first generation American. Most of the other folks we're talking about today were second generation. So what was the world of this New York Jewish elite? It was very much based on the Upper East Side. You can see from this map, these are where the partners of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, all of these wealthy German origin Jews lived, all on Fifth Avenue. This is Temple Emmanuel, the Reform synagogue, still around today, that they tended to belong to. This is the period of radical reform as well, when the Reform movement officially, as part of its platform, rejected the idea of a Jewish national identity and rejected the idea of Jews settling in Palestine. And then this third picture, does anyone recognize this building today? Did I hear it? The Jewish Museum, very good. The Jewish Museum, before it was the Jewish Museum, was Felix Warburg's house. And so you can imagine the kind of wealth we are talking about. His wife donated upon their death, but if your house is big enough to be a major museum in New York City, we are talking about a very wealthy individual. So this is the world that the founders of what came to be the Palestine Economic Corporation inhabited. So we talked about this quote with the trash basket of dissatisfied Jewish individuals, but this tone begins to change in the mid-1920s. And the point where this really happens, or the place where this really happens, is at this nonpartisan conference to consider Palestine problems. This is held at the Hotel Astor here in New York City. And it brings in the kind of Jewish elite, these non-Zionists, they use the term nonpartisan here, but also use the term non-Zionist, who are trying to carve out a niche between an embrace of Zionism and Jewish nationalism and a total rejection of Jewish settlement in Palestine. So Lewis Marshall, this important leader who chairs it, sends this out with the note, and I won't be reading all of this quote, don't worry. He says, "Now the time has come when it would seem proper for the Jews of this country to determine upon a course of action towards Palestine. It is no longer a theory, but a condition that confronts us." And then the second paragraph, he says, "As loyal American citizens, we have a right to consider the question as to what, if anything, shall be done with regard to Palestine and its development. And as loyal Jews, we have the duty to take action with regard to this all-important subject." So we are seeing a change of tone. It is still trying to strike out this ground. This is not a full-throated embrace of the idea of Zionism or Jews moving to Palestine. But he's saying, as Americans, we could consider this. And as Jews, we really need to consider this. So what is the reason for this changing tone? There's a few things to consider. First is the Balfour Declaration, what we saw on slide 1. The British government has officially endorsed the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So now they have this interesting calculation. Britain is a US ally. The US Congress ends up ratifying in support of this. Which is the proper American position then? Is the proper American position to say, yes, we agree with the US Congress and this US ally? Or is the proper American position to say, no, we reject Jewish nationalism? So the Balfour Declaration, it's celebrated by Zionists on the Lower East Side. It is a real moment of consternation for this Upper East Side Jewish elite. Even more important, though, and this is where anti-Semitism really comes into play, is immigration restrictions. The nonpartisan conference happens at a moment where they have not yet come into place, but it is clear the writing on the wall that it is. So for those of you who are not familiar, in the 1920s is a period where new laws are passed which severely limit Jewish immigration. Well, they limit all sorts of immigration to the United States from Europe, and they are crafted in part because of anti-Semitism, by this idea that too many Jews, not to mention Italians and Irish, are coming into this country and they're not the right sort of people. This is obviously in the mind of those in support of these. So they impose new quotas upon immigration. And as Marshall says, if the infamous bill, which is now before Congress, known as the Johnson Bill, were to pass, it would mean that our doors, which were open to us and our parents, would be closed to those equally worthy of the privilege who desire to enter them. Where shall the Jew go? Where will they find its outlet, if not in Palestine? So you can see, again, they really have no clear answer to this question. They don't want to support Zionism or its ideals. They're on record for that. They truly believe in this Americanization idea, but they have no other idea of where can Jews who are being pushed out of Eastern Europe due to anti-Semitism and poverty, where else is the solution to them? And then the third idea is the idea that inaction will also cause more anti-Semitism because Jews will be seen as not helping their own. He says, I'm afraid that non-action of that kind, indifference of that character, can do to us 1,000 times more harm than all the Ku Klux Klans and Henry Fords you can crowd into this great city. Clearly a very strong statement by Marshall, who, again, as a civil rights lawyer, had fought both Henry Ford and the Ku Klux Klan for their anti-Semitism. So what to do in this? I refer to this as the politics of the apolitical, which leads to a non-Zionist and Zionist alliance among these elites in the United States. They formed together what they call the Palestine Economic Corporation, and this is from their initial incorporation papers. And it says it has been formed to afford an instrument through which American Jews and others who may be interested may give material aid on a strictly business basis to productive Palestinian entities, and thereby further the economic development of the Holy Land and the resettlement there of an increasing number of Jews. And so the theory here, which they reiterate time and time again, is that this is not politics, this is business. As long as we are just investing, we are just doing capitalism, we are not taking a definitive political stand, we are not embracing Zionism, and in fact, we are being good Americans, because this is the period when American corporations are increasingly starting to invest abroad, especially based here in New York. So the idea is if J.P. Morgan, that great American, can invest all over the world, if the United Fruit Corporation, whose, by the way, their president was on the board of the Palestine Economic Corporation, if they can start investing in Latin America and the Caribbean, why can't we do that? This affirms our American identity rather than rejecting it. Warburg puts this rather bluntly with his vision for what needs to happen. He says, Palestine, if it is to develop at all, must be developed on business lines, pure and simple. Speech making will not develop the country, and here he's using an antiquated form of this term. Politics will retard it, meaning slow down the development, not in the current offensive use of the term. At the same time, partially because of this, some Zionists are starting to sound rather similar in the United States. A little before this, Louis Brandeis, at the time the head of the American Zionist movement, he's later ousted, it's a long story, says something very similar. He says, politics may now be banished. Certainly politics may go into suspense. He says this actually to the World Zionist movement, and this is part of why he gets ousted. European Zionists don't like this idea. But he's coming from the same American environment as Warburg, one that wants to be very careful about what we say we are doing abroad and what we say we are doing with our identity. Both of them have this idea that through investment, they can affirm their Americanness rather than losing out on it. And so they create this instrument together that they insist will only engage in non-political action in Palestine. So this brings us part 2 to investment. The quote here, we can do for Palestine what we have done for other countries. Help it stand on its own legs as soon as possible and stop charity as soon as possible and let the laws of economics take their course. It's not as fun as the last quote, but I probably could talk about this quote for the entire hour-long lecture. There is so much here. 45-minute lecture, sorry. There is so much here. The first part, though, I want to point out is he says what we have done for other countries. What does Warburg mean by this? There's a chance he means like he's involved in the Joint Distribution Committee, which increasingly is now at this point investing in Eastern Europe to help Eastern European Jews there sort of stand on their own 2 feet. They're creating credit cooperatives and things like that. But I think the we here is Americans. This is, again, him trying to say, if American corporations can be spreading abroad in this moment, can be investing abroad, we can do that too. We can do that for Palestine. And because there's such a belief, both in this era, and I would say it continues today, that capitalism is something natural and a universal good. His belief is that if we jumpstart this process in Palestine, it's like a flywheel. The motion will continue. We no longer will need to continue to dump money like they had to do in World War I to maintain the Jewish population there. We can just get the economic wheels in motion. From Palestine, though, there's a very different perspective. Most folks in Palestine are not aware that there's this new organization called the Palestine Economic Corporation. But the leaders of the Zionist movement certainly take notice. In particular, the treasurer of the Zionist movement, Siegfried Adolf van Vrieselen, seems to recognize the incredible importance of what's happening. In the late 1920s, the Zionist movement is in the moment of an economic crisis. Palestine is in recession, but more importantly, They can't afford to continue to create new settlements because there's no form of support for their old ones. So they have economically mature settlements in Palestine that have been around for decades now, but there's no lending system. Long-term loans, there are short-term loans, but there are no source of long-term loans for their settlements to continue to grow. So if an agricultural cooperative or Pardes Khana or Degania wants to build a new chicken coop or bring new land into agricultural production, the only source of funds for that are from the Zionist movement or other similar agencies that are operating at the time. And Van Vriesland says this is an existential threat because by the late 1920s, 100% of Zionist funds raised abroad are being used to furnish existing debts. How can we create a new national home when all we can do is pay what we already have? And he says the solution for this is the Palestine Economic Corporation. He says these are investors that will do risky investments that maybe the JP Morgans of the world won't do, but they will do it on a business basis. This won't take philanthropic dollars away from us, but it will relieve us of the debts of mature settlements and allow us to continue to expand the movement. He says of this very bluntly, if we were, however, not convinced that colonization will become a paying proposition in Palestine, there will be no hope for the Jewish national home. We are confident with, and that's an indecipherable word, splendid human material of our settlers, colonization will succeed. So on the one hand, the Palestine Economic Corporation is saying that this is not about Zionism. This is completely different. And on the other hand, the treasurer of the Zionist movement says this is the most important thing that's ever happened in Zionism. A huge contrast. All right, so I'm going to go through rapid fire some of what they accomplished in their first 10 years in Palestine. First, and I would argue most important, is the creation of this long-term loan system. So they give both long-term loans for agriculture, and as you'll see in a moment, for mortgages too. And this is revolutionary. Not only does it allow new poultry coops to be built or new farms to be expanded, also you'll note here, the farms here, this does not look like the traditional kibbutz model. It looks like the homesteads of the American West, and that's very intentional. They bring in experts from the West to design these. But it actually transforms the whole economic system among Jews in Palestine. Because if you're just getting a seasonal loan for seeds, for example, that can be a handshake deal at the time. You know, they understand once you go to harvest, you'll pay back the loan. Long-term loans are very different. That requires double entry bookkeeping. That requires regular auditing, inspections, mortgages. I mean, you have all probably gone through this in the room, or lots of you have. It completely transforms the way the economy functions because almost every Jewish agricultural institution in the country applies for these loans. And even those that don't get them recognize that if they ever want to get them, they have to conform with the standards of a modern capitalist economy. So Kibbutz Degania, great socialist experiment, starts having an auditor and double entry bookkeeping take place there. Similar for individuals with mortgages. You now have to have your personal finances done in a very different way. A letter of character will no longer suffice. Also, these homes were designed specifically to be American-style homes. They were built in the Old North in Tel Aviv. That was a neighborhood they financed. Pardes Khana, Benyamina, and then the Krayot around Haifa, for those who are familiar with the geography of Mandate Palestine and modern Israel. Industrialization and modernization. I put modernization in scare quotes, as historians always like to. These are the photos that they provide. So they are trying to tell a specific narrative here, the PEC, but there's some reality here. On the one side, we see a weaving operation prior to loans given by the PEC, clearly being done, mostly by hand here. On the right, we see the mechanization that happens after these loans. They estimate in their first 7 years of operation, 33% of all Jewish industry in Palestine received a loan, either a small or large loan from them. Water drilling. The PEC brought in drilling equipment from the Western United States. They had a drilling expert, an oil drilling expert actually, on their board who personally oversaw this. And these were able to dig deeper wells than any equipment that previously existed in Palestine. So again, a narrative that they are trying to craft here, but we can see the well up in the corner with the camels, an old-fashioned well, and then a mechanized well after they bring it in, changing the water system in the country. Construction at Haifa Bay. This is one of their two major projects. Haifa, as I mentioned, was seen in Palestine as the city of the future, the economic center that would be connecting Palestine to the rest of the world with this new deep water port the British built. They buy a huge amount of land. The story of that purchase is a long one that I won't get into today, around the area, and they bring in an elite town planner from the United Kingdom, Sir Patrick Abercrombie, who we see in these photos here, in order to design it. And they create it to be the industrial center of the region. It's also the only what is called a noxious zone in all of Palestine, where a concentration of heavy manufacturing is allowed. And that remains really this industrial center up until very, very recently, that echoes within the state of Israel. Mining at the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea at the time was seen as the greatest source, untapped source, of the mineral potash. Potash is one of the 3 necessary ingredients for fertilizer. And unlike nitrogen, which can be taken from the air, this can only be mined from very specific sources. And at the time, most of those sources were in Germany. During World War I, Germany refused, obviously, to export that to rival countries, and it led to a global food crisis. Britain was obsessed with the idea of securing their own source of potash. And one of the reasons they wanted the mandate for Palestine was this potash in the Dead Sea, which you can see from this New York Times article, and I believe it was 1924, was valued between $100 and $200 billion in 1924 dollars. That is in the trillions today. The Dead Sea was also seen as maybe an impossible place to work. Potash had never been extracted from water. It was the lowest point on Earth with unbearably hot temperatures. And so the British didn't want to do it themselves. They released a call for concessions. Different people bid on it, General Motors. There were Arab concessioners that came in. And one Jewish Zionist named Moshe Novomaisky from Siberia was the only individual with a proven method for potash extraction from water. The problem is he had no capital, and the British told him they would pass on his bid unless he could prove it. At the last moment, the Palestine Economic Corporation came in, provided his startup capital, and he won the concession for exclusive rights to mine minerals from the Dead Sea. Throughout the entire pre-state period, the PEC became the largest single shareholder of Palestine Potash Incorporated. For those of you who have been, today this is Dead Sea Works. This is the predecessor company to it. So part 3, consequences. And this, we have this much more florally quote from Warburg, embracing his identity as a non-Zionist developing the region together with Zionists. It was stated in 1930, but it feels better to tag it onto 1937 on his obituary, where it was quoted again. I have next to this a Rorschach test, an ink blot, because that is somewhat what the Palestine Economic Corporation functions as. Depending on the views you came into this room with, will greatly affect how you feel about what they did in Palestine. If you think that Jewish settlement in the region is an unquestioned good, then you will feel great because they promoted a huge amount of Jewish settlement in the region. By turning the country into what looked more like a country, they also, a functioning capitalist economy, an electrical grid. This is what a modern nation looks like. This was hugely important for then becoming a country, even though that wasn't their stated intention. So if you think that's a good thing, the state of Israel being founded in 1948, you will think great of what they accomplished there. They created a much more functioning capitalist economy, one that at times was less equal, and I'll be frank, did really tremendous environmental damage, some of their projects. Haifa Bay is the most polluted part of modern day Israel. The Dead Sea is an ecological disaster. But if you see the trade-off there between prosperity and some environmental degradation, depending on how you feel on that will affect what you feel about the consequences. I could dive into any of these different avenues for exploration, but as is so often the case when talking about Israel-Palestine, I will be talking mostly about Jewish-Arab relations. And the fact that I believe that there are consequences from their action that made relations between Jews and Arabs worse, even though that was actually contrary to what they believed and wanted to happen. So who does the economy work for? This is a quote from Felix Warburg about how he felt about his work. He believed that through this investment, they would achieve better roads for better hospitals, for better schools, for better technical education, for better civil service training, better understanding, and here he's talking about between Jews and Arabs, more ample cooperation and greater watchfulness against vicious agitation will be brought about. He saw investment as the solution to the conflict between Jews and Arabs. The person pictured next to him here is Musa Alami, an Arab nationalist who is sometimes a negotiating partner of Warburg, and who Warburg tried to bring in as an investor on Palestine Potash Limited. Because again, he wanted that to be an olive branch to the Arabs of the country. The reality, though, I would argue, is that the opposite happens in many different ways that I'll go through quickly now. First, who has access to credit? I talked a lot about credit and how important this is. I know it's a boring subject, but credit ends up being really, really critical for the ways modern economies function. And they create this entirely new system of long-term credit in Palestine, but they only offer it to Jews. And this is because to them, this is, yes, a capitalist process, but is also a humanitarian endeavor. The very goal that they came in was to allow more Jews to settle in Palestine, to improve the Jewish economy. So they see no problem in that this is exclusively a Jewish system. Just like the JDC, they say, they don't create the Joint Distribution Committee to go into Eastern Europe and help, Poles and Slavs with their farms. Why would they do that with their humanitarian capitalist endeavor? But this obviously leads to real problems. And we have a similar history in the United States about some groups getting access to credit and some not. This is a map of redlining in New York City. And we all know the ramifications of that here, or we all have some idea of the ramifications. We have not begun to study what the ramifications of this difference in credit access is in Palestine, but it is significant. And I would say is one of the sources of tension we see coming out of this. And Arabs do apply for loans, by the way. And the British begs them to give loans for Arabs, and they kind of stall on that. I can talk more about that maybe in the Q&A. Wage disparity. Initially, the Palestine Economic Corporation only wanted to hire Jews at Palestine Potash Limited and the King David Hotel, which they also were the major investor for. The British refused to let this happen. It probably wouldn't have worked regardless. So they hired both Jews and Arabs, and they actually presented as an example of the sort of work they want to do to build bridges. The problem is, and this is within the logic of the day, they're very open about it, they do not pay them the same. We can see on this document that for a day of work, an Arab laborer was paid 3 shillings, and a Jewish laborer was paid 10 shillings. This did not match up to skilled and unskilled labor as they classified it either. And Jewish workers also were giving a living stipend on top of that. The Arab laborers were not. And I will say, Arab newspapers ran stories about this, about the feeling of being left out of the wealth from Palestine Potash, the workers there. Who benefits from development? Along Haifa Bay, Patrick Abercrombie, the designer they bring in, he says, this was about as perfect as a tabula rasa as a planner could ask for. He was referring to the lack of prior development in Haifa Bay and to the few commitments made as of 1930. So tabula rasa, that means he saw it as a blank slate. And to be fair to him, this is not like maybe areas in the American West where there are like huge, large amount of Native Americans. We really weren't, American developers really didn't see anything. There were not many people living there. But there were some Arab communities living there at the time and one Jewish community. The design was explicitly made, he said, without any concern for commitments made to them, and the Arab communities were all relocated. The Arab communities were pushed off without given relocation area. The one Jewish community was given alternative land to relocate there. Again, this becomes a major source of consternation for Arabs in the mandate, the idea of loss of land, that are happening through legal purchases. This land was purchased from the owner of it, who was not the tenants who lived on it. This seemed like a normal capitalist process to the leaders of the PEC, but to the Arabs who felt this attachment to the land, who had been there for generations, and who were forced off without any compensation, this became a major source of political conflict. Who benefits from the country's resources? This is a well that was made at Wadi al-Haweth, near an Arab settlement where the Jewish National Fund had bought some land. The water that was pumped out of there was not for the community of Wadi al-Haweth. It was pumped south to Kfar Brandeis, named after Louis Brandeis. And the resources did not go to that community. Later, this community would also be expelled from their land. The PEC was not involved in the expulsion. This is a pre-state expulsion because the land, again, was legally purchased. They were not legal owners of the land. But this becomes actually one of, if not the largest cause célèbre among Arabs in the area for an example of how the Zionist movement they see as hurting them. The PEC wasn't involved in that expulsion, but they do have a well right there that is not giving resources to them and has no comment, sort of, on what is going on. So the conclusions I want you to take from all of this. First, and I think it's really important to note that this investment was fundamentally motivated by anti-Semitism, both globally and the United States. This was not their preferred method for how to deal with this. These New York Jewish elite believed in the idea that America could be the promised land for Jews to move to. They were a little concerned about too many moving too fast. Maybe they're a little embarrassing, but they fought against immigration restrictions very hard, and they lost that fight. Also, the push factor from Eastern Europe and later Nazi Germany that pushes even more investment into Palestine as they see the need to absorb more refugees. Second, these methods were an attempt to affirm their Americanness. They engaged in investment because they saw that as the American thing to do. They did not make that discourse. They weren't the creators of that agreement, that vision of Americanness, but they sought to engage in it to prove that they were good Americans. Third, the claim to be apolitical, if anything, hid the effects of their actions from themselves. This was so important to their identity of what they did in Palestine that they could ignore obvious cases where they were being involved in political action. And they were constantly having to recalibrate what meant to be apolitical based on changing circumstances. I'm happy to get into that some maybe in the Q&A if people are curious about that. Fourth, the fusing of capitalism and humanitarianism, something I will add we still see quite a bit of today, benefited some greatly, but comes at cost to others. And you can also say that about just capitalism or just humanitarianism. And fifth, there are ongoing legacies of this. The fact that Israel is a capitalist country today, connected to global markets, a rich and prosperous country, but one also with, I believe, of any developed nation, the highest or second highest rate of wage disparity. This has a longer history than historians have long recognized. The US-Israel alliance, the idea that Israel is somehow an extension of this affirming of American identity or American identity. I don't want to just connect that to the Palestine Economic Corporation, but it does grow out of this too. And then yes, as I noticed here, mentioned already, the disparities in the modern Israeli economy have a longer history as well. And so with that, I want to say thank you to everyone here. Thank you so much to Fordham and the New York Public Library. And I am happy to do a shortened Q&A now until we have to leave, and then afterwards, again, to answer questions either formally or informally.
So I suggest I ask for like really short questions, and maybe we take 3 at a time so you can answer. Yes.
I'm just curious, was the PC profitable?
Great question. Do you want to take a couple at a time?
Yeah. You
The execs.
Oh, wow.
Any other question? Okay.
I have a question about transportation. You mentioned just in passing in that quote about better roads to hospitals. What about things like roads and trains? I remember going to the north of Israel a few years ago and seeing old train stations. And seeing maybe an exhibit at, I forget the name of the museum in Tel Aviv, about rail networks that were used to transport milk, I think, from the Galilee to Haifa in a very short time, as opposed to, it would have spoiled if it had gone.
And I have one question from repeat the question for Zoom, but I have one question from the audience here. One of our graduate students. You mentioned that the committee brought in experts from the American West, familiar with the Homestead Act, to weigh in on the agriculture efforts in Palestine. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so 3 fantastic questions. The first one about profit. Yes, it was. They made a profit every year they operated in Palestine. Though part of their goal of being both humanitarian and capitalist is that they capped dividends at 2%, which was a very modest dividend for the time prior to the Great Depression. Then suddenly the Great Depression comes and the rest of the global economy is not doing so well. Palestine does okay during the Great Depression. And suddenly their humanitarian capitalist effort is like paying out better than other stocks. But yes, they do create profits every year. I've been trying harder to understand just how much profit they create. It is very difficult in part because I finally found the letter that proves that for complicated reasons, they have a lot of like sort of shell corporations and different funds they are tapping into. And they realize at a point that they're actually operating illegally in Palestine and don't know what to do about it. So they just hide it and it doesn't appear on their balance sheet. I don't know the full history of that, but I'm like, for years, I'm like, these numbers don't add up. And I finally found the letter being like, uh-oh, we made a whoopsies. So that was really great to know that. But yes, they are profitable. Roads and trains, they are not so involved in. And the reason for this is because it's one of the few things the British will invest in. The idea of the mandate for the British, partially based on anti-Semitic beliefs, is that world Jewry is going to provide the money for development, so we don't have to. They'll provide for a few key things: the deep water port at Haifa, train transportation, the pipeline from Mosul, but everything else World Jewry can take care of. Now, the money doesn't fully materialize, but the PEC kind of stays out of anything that the British are already doing because they don't want them to pull back even more. They have a very limited involvement in some key areas for bringing oranges, but it's not really critical. And then the third question about the American West is a fantastic one, and one that, as I'm now transitioning to think about this as a dissertation to a book, I'm more and more involved in. One of the key actors here is Elwood Mead, who Lewis Marshall refers to as the greatest expert of colonization of his era. He was in the UC system and later part of the, whatever the predecessor to the Department of the Interior, I can't remember what it was called at the time, in the American West. And he has brought, I think, on multiple trips to Palestine to involve on citriculture, well drilling, homesteads. He's also brought by the Zionist movement and releases a report extremely critical of the kibbutzim and suggests homesteading as an alternative. There are some other experts they bring too, but he's the really critical one. They also, it's funny, I was just reading yesterday in the New York Public Library, they're working with a well drilling company to get their equipment for drilling to Palestine. And the company has two offices, one in New York and one in Los Angeles. And they realize that they've been talking to the New York office and not the Los Angeles office. And there's no difference between the two of them. It's the same company. And they're like, oh no, we have to start writing the Los Angeles one now. Like, this is all wrong. They don't know about well drilling. We need someone from the American West to do it. And this was also in Palestine understood. The comparison to California was very popular in Palestine at the time. There's a great book on that titled California Dreaming by Nachum Karlinsky, if you want to read more about that.
Israel bonds. Say anything about how that ties in when it begins, and I mean, it plays through right to modern New York, obviously. Right?
I'm smiling because the only tie I know of is that's my plan for my second book. It's a little post the date I look at. Yeah. I think there are some no, I think you're right. I think it's all post date. Yeah, so it's a little later. One of the mysteries of the PEC too, after 1937, the archival trail really tails off. It continues to exist until like 2008 as the Israel Economic Corporation, parentheses PEC. I just got at the Dorot Jewish Division had their annual reports up until the 90s, some years of them. I haven't looked in them yet. So I don't know what role they continue to play. I think it's pretty small. They're mostly just a holding company at that point. I don't think there's a connection to Israel bonds as in a material, tangible connection. But I think the idea that investment is a form of support that is also an acceptable form of supporting groups abroad, I think that is a longer legacy that comes out of this period. And that's why now that I'm on the job market, if anyone knows of any academic job open, you have to start saying what your next book is going to be about too. And so I thought about it a bit. I thought the next natural step is to write about Israel bonds, not just as a financial instrument, but also a cultural one. Sorry, I cut you off before you could ask more questions.
Two questions related to the first cartoon. So one is about a specific audience, on the left-hand side, the figure about on the left-hand side. But the other question I actually had, how this cartoon can be read in the context of the post-1929 riots, and then the British Inquiry Commission that dealt with the violence in Palestine.
Yeah, so what was the first question about specifically?
About who is that figure on the left side of the cartoon? Like,
I believe that's the British, that I think is supposed to represent the British kind of government there and the sort of military presence. You see the very fancy uniform, not common otherwise except by the British in the region.
Is that an airplane?
Yes, that is an airplane. At the time, an aerodrome, which is similar to an airport, is being built in Haifa. Being built, in fact, on Palestine Economic Corporation land that they buy, and they are a major driver of that aerodrome being built. As for how this would have been read in the context, so I should mention this cartoon came out in a special issue that was about the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. So it certainly was harkening back to that history. But also, yes, I think the post-1929 history. So in 1929, you have the first, not the first, but the most major case of intercommunal violence in the Mandate. And it really changes perceptions about Jewish settlement, Zionism, the future of the region. And you have this British Commission of Inquiry asking it. I think to some degree, this is a rebuke of the idea that comes out of that development can still be what saves us all. The idea that as long as we invest enough and as long as everyone materially benefits, things will get better. What this cartoon is saying is actually these things are tied together, that the capitalist development of the region is connected to Arab loss of power. Now, a further question that one could ask, and I think one should ask, maybe not a historian, but someone else, is, did it have to be this way? Could the region still have developed economically in a way that was appealing to all parties and maybe wouldn't replace a true political process, but was the idea of capitalist development benefiting all in the country only wrong because of how it was done, or was it 100% fundamentally flawed? Again, I don't have an answer to that question. I have my own ideas about it, but I think it is worth asking.
So last question and then we'll wrap up.
You mentioned that the apolitical actors, Warburg and other PCC founders, hid from themselves the consequences of their actions. And I'm just wondering, like, could they have been that naive?
I think they had to be. They had no other option for what to do with these Jews who were fleeing first Eastern Europe and then Nazi Germany. And so the only answer they had was to insist, or to have a full-throated endorsement of Zionism, or to just say we're going to do a contradiction. And humans tend not to do those things. They don't endorse something they don't want to support, and they don't say I'm going to be a big contradiction of my morals. And so you see incredible wrangling of what it means to be apolitical or not. And I'll just give a couple short examples. When they first come in, they say, we aren't going to give any loans to Zionist-supported settlements. We'll loan to the ones that are supported by the Rothschilds or other ones. But if you have an official relationship with a Zionist institution, we're not going to do it. They don't actually, they say it to each other, but they don't tell their partners in Palestine that. And so their banker in Palestine, he has to get approval for all loans. And he gives one really small loan. I think he was very clever politically. I don't think this was an accident. To a Zionist settlement, Nahalal, for a chicken coop without getting approval. And the PEC leaders are apoplectic. They say, we didn't approve for this loan, you can't give it. And he says, oh, you just don't want me to give this loan because it's a Zionist loan. And he says, it's funny because they have a better financial condition than other places you've given. So you guys are being political by not loaning to Zionists. And they say, no, that's not the case. They say, if you take back the loan, we'll prove that we're not political this way, because then we'll give a different loan to someone else that is a Zionist as long as they meet our financial criteria. And the different people end up being the same people. It's still Nahalal. And again, this guy, Harry Vitalis, he's very clever. He says the same thing. He says, you still haven't proven it to us. Us in Palestine, everyone thinks you're just being political with where you get the money. And so they end up giving more, and eventually that kind of falls by the wayside, that giving to Zionists is too political. It becomes the other way around, not giving to Zionists being political. The other one I'll say is when the British ask them to make sure that they're loan to Arabs, they try to stall essentially, and they say, well, we'll form a committee in order to make sure that politics is kept out of the process. Because we're worried if we're loaning to Arabs, it's really a political decision and not an economic one. Who chairs the committee? David Ben-Gurion, the future prime minister of the state of Israel. So having him chair it to keep politics out of the process, it's a gymnastics act that they're having to do, but I truly believe that they're doing it.
So on that, let us thank Jacob for this amazing talk and for teaching us how we can discuss controversial topics in a substantive way and learn together. So thank you. Let's continue our conversation outside. And again, congratulations and thank you.